Hi, everyone. Welcome to Concussions and Women podcast, a series hosted under the Concussion Talk podcast by founder Nick Mercer. My name is Dr. Alyssa Mamini, and it is my honor to host this critical series highlighting differences in injury management and support for women who sustain concussions. Today, I am joined by Dr. Christopher DeLauro, a professor at the U.S. Air Force Academy, where his research, spanning EEG, neuroimaging, blood biomarkers, and machine learning, has helped expose the gender gap in concussion science, including a landmark study on the underrepresentation of female athletes in major concussion consensus statements. He earned his PhD in cognitive psychology and neuroscience from the University of Colorado at Boulder and completed postdoctoral research at Carnegie Mellon University. His work has been featured by CBS News, NPR, The Washington Post, and CNN, and recognized with the NCAA Mind Matters Research Award. Dr. DeLauro brings a rare interdisciplinary lens to his work, bridging cognitive neuroscience, public health, and behavioral science to connect what's happening in the brain and the real-world decision athletes and cadets make about their own health. Dr. DeLauro, welcome to the Concussions and Women podcast.
Hey, thank you for inviting me, and I'm really happy to be here.
We're so excited for you to be here. So before we dive into your research, I was hoping we could just start off by just learning a little bit about yourself. How did you first become interested in concussion research, and how did you get involved with the U.S. Air Force Academy?
Yeah, so I have a pretty weird and long story about this, but I did not actually go back to graduate school until I was 30.
Um,
And so that's a little bit atypical, but I grew up in Philadelphia. I obviously live in Colorado now, but growing up in Philadelphia, I was a big sports fan. And there was this hockey player named Eric Lindros, who was one of the best hockey players in the league, but kept suffering from concussions, even though he was really physically imposing as a player. And so that kind of started this thread of it's really sort of strange that anybody of any size, any fitness can suffer from this injury, and it's a really serious one.
mhm.
And so for me, like academically, I started as a biology major with an English minor at a small school called Dickinson College. So you can already see I can't do things normally, and I can't make up my mind about what I'm interested in. But I did that, and then worked for a while. I worked in cell biology labs for science marketing companies, doing all sorts of things. And then one of my friends, um, I started to take these classes in Pennsylvania to teach in high school, which is what I thought I wanted to do. You have to get a master's degree. And the first class I took was cognitive psychology. And I did really well enough that my professor encouraged me to get a PhD. So I
Wow.
applied. Yeah. And so I applied, and she said, I think you will be a good high school teacher if that's what you choose to do, but I think you can also do more if you want to. And so I applied and wound up going to the University of Colorado Boulder. That's how I wound up in Boulder. But a thing that really impacted me was both that professor, Dr. Vogelson, she and I sort of cold called a random Penn psychology professor to ask what other courses I should take as a biology major to prep for psychology graduate school. And he had no obligation, but helped me a ton. And so that also is like one of the things that kind of stuck in my head is how much we need to help each other in this field and in science, right? And so for me, I got to Boulder and I worked on face recognition in EEG with a guy named Tim Curran, who I'm still friends with. And when I graduated, I really liked that work, that neuroimaging. I tried to extend it more. And I went to Carnegie Mellon to work with a guy named Mike Tarr, who is really well known. But, and this is a thing that I think often you hear women talk about this, but not as much male science. 30. I also married my wife at 30, and we had our first child when I was in graduate school. And since she had a, you know, real job, I was the primary caregiver. And then we had our second child when I was at Carnegie Mellon as a postdoc. And it is very prestigious to be a Carnegie Mellon, but you cannot eat prestige. And so I was like, I'm going to get myself a real job. And my advisor, Mike Tarr, even though I was not there as long as I would have liked to have been, was totally on board with helping me. He's like, what does your family need and what do you need for your career to be successful? That's my goal. And so that's how I wound up at the Air Force Academy. I knew I loved Colorado from my time in Boulder. And when I got there, I thought, you know what? This is a really good job. I've done a lot of things for me. And this is something that I will make work for me, but it's really going to work for my family. And so that's kind of how I wound up at the Air Force Academy.
Really cool. And do you mind just explaining how does that research setting differ from non-military institutions or universities?
Yeah, so this is like um really integral to how I wound up doing the kind of stuff that I do. When I worked in Boulder and at Carnegie Mellon, who have every resource in the world, they're the R1s of R1s. And so I was doing neuroimaging, but there were people running the neuroimaging lab, both paid professionals and undergraduate volunteers. And when I'm out here, I have like a room that I have to figure out how to put a bunch of equipment in, including EEG if that's what I want to do. And EEG costs like 60 to $100,000, right? And so without startup, so it's a very unique situation here. I teach a 3-3 course load, which is more like a liberal arts school. And so one of the ways that I introduce people who are coming or are new to the Air Force Academy, some of the environment, some of it is weird good and other is weird bad. So like our semester starts August 6th. Our winter semester, yes, our spring semester starts January 6th. That's the weird bad part. Okay. The weird good is that there are just unique opportunities here. Resources, if you're doing something that you can convince people, and it has to be true, is
Right.
doing a better job of taking care of our cadets, they
Mhm.
will invest in that. And so while I really wanted to get EEG and do more face recognition research, I recognized from my teaching and talking to my kids, advising, there were so many concussions going on.
Mhm.
And then I started thinking, a lot of the things that go on around here make it a really good environment for studying concussions. You have very motivated students. You have non-athletes who are basically as fit as athletes at other schools. And in fact, some of our club marathon cadets are like more fit than some of our D1 athletes. You know what
Yeah,
I mean? And
I
so
believe it.
and so you get some better comparisons for athlete versus non-athlete here than you would at other schools. And over time, I sort of realized, even before CARE came here, like this is a really unique opportunity to do certain things. And I should look into what those are. And I'm not going to be able to teaching a 3-3 load where my service job is chief scientist for the IRB. I am just not going to be able to outright the face recognition researchers at Stanford whose work I love. That's just not going to happen. So be different and novel in a different way. And this is one of the ways that I sort of came up with.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for sharing.
Yes.
Next, I would love to discuss your 2022 evidence review and synthesis on the underrepresentation of female athletes in research, informing influential concussion consensus and position statements. So for the listeners who are not familiar with this work, I just wanted to give a quick overview. So Dr. DeLaro and his team assessed about 171 distinct studies with human participants across 3 consensus statements. So that's going to include the National Athletic Trainers Association, the NATA position statement, the International Consensus on Concussion in Sport Group consensus statement, and the American Medical Society for Sports Medicine consensus statement. The research team noted that samples were overall 80% male, and 40% of studies included no female participants at all. And really, the big key takeaway, which I certainly agree with, is we need more intentional recruitment in concussion-related research, as underrepresentation of female athletes in the data are really underlying concussion consensus and position papers. We want to make sure that we're including them so that we are addressing those effectively in clinical practice. So my first question on the study, which was fascinating to read, and I commend you and your team for this work, how did you first come up with this idea to investigate this topic?
Yeah. So there was another paper I published first called Reconsidering Return to Play.
Mm,
Um, and in that paper, I looked at our local concussion recovery times and then like the big literature that's mostly elite male athletes
mm,
at the time. People like Margaret Patukian's papers and things like that. So great scientists, but they were all looking at the only data available really was these elite athletes.
mm.
And so then I want to acknowledge also my wife is a doctorate of physical therapy, and she actually works for Children's Hospital Colorado.
Oh,
And she's actually published a paper with David Howell, actually.
gosh,
And
cool.
so we're discussing concussion at night. And keep in mind, like, I train in face recognition. I have like boxes and boxes of like printed out papers from my defense. And I trained myself into concussion. So I just read a lot. And whenever you read a lot and you're new to a field, you're like, how much don't we know and how much don't I know?
Mm,
There's always that worry that you're missing something. And
sure.
so in the intro to into this reconsidering return to play paper, I'm looking at studies and I'm like, wow, these women's recovery numbers are really lower. Let me go find the studies that are done on them. And there was really not much. And then I was like, well, obviously there's some paper that's going to say, hey, we don't do enough research on women's concussions. And I kept looking and I couldn't find it. And I published this intro where I just asserted we should do more research with no citation. And then when I won this Mind Matters Award, I started to work with Julianne Schmidt at the University of Georgia, whose work I'm sure you're familiar with. If you're in the concussion space, she's terrific.
Yeah.
And like me, she's very interdisciplinary. And I was like, is there a paper I can cite that shows this? She's like, I don't know of one. And then I talked to another person who you're very familiar with. It's like, Steve Brolio, can you tell me, is there a paper that tells us what is the relative underrepresentation of women in concussion research? And he didn't know. And at that point, I was like, there is functionally no paper that does this. If Steve Brolio is not publishing this, it just doesn't exist. And
Yeah.
now I'm comfortable enough to be like, okay, we've got to look into this.
Yeah.
And this actually started as a cadet. The cadet wanted to do public health research with me. And so I put her on first the concussion in sport group statement.
Mhm.
And then when it came out kind of the way I thought it would, I brought it to Julianne and we thought, what can we add to this? That's like one statement is not enough.
Mhm.
And so we went through all of them together and created the whole set of studies where we assessed everything and the papers. And then we knew this as I knew as soon as I knew nobody published this, I was like, this is going to be a big paper. So you have to do it right and you have to do it well. And you
Right.
can't let the rug get yanked out from under you and let people like not address this topic properly because you screwed up, especially being a male first author on this paper. You know what I mean? Like you feel an extra responsibility to do this absolutely right. And so then Julianne and I had a manuscript together. She had come out for the summer on a special Air Force funding trip for external experts. This is the weird good part of the Air Force Academy, right? She moved her whole family out for the summer to study with me. And
Wow.
we proposed a couple other grants, one of which got funded, and we wrote this paper. And um, then we gave it to Steve to make sure he's been on these committees. Are we being unfair to anybody? Is there anything we're missing? We don't want to just be throwing rocks at more senior scientists. This is important to make sure the whole field adopts this like wholeheartedly. And it's about understanding how we all have to do better and like including us. And so I think that was really so this started all the way with my very first concussion paper and thinking it was weird. And being on the IRB, if you recruit people to a study, you have to have it be equitable recruitment. So you could never get away with these numbers if it was recruited studies, but because it's sports as a laboratory,
Mhm.
you just collect what's most efficient, and that turns out to be a lot of big rostered male collision sports. And so
Right.
we have to think about that a lot.
Right. Absolutely. Love that background. I had no idea about that collaboration between you and Julianne with the Air Force. So that's really cool context. Thank you for sharing. As you were going through analyzing all of these documents, what were some of the findings that surprised you?
Yeah, so a lot of this probably now you could do like with agents, stuff like that. I
Mhm.
think the overall like I haven't read and physically looked at the paper in a while, even though I know it very well, obviously. But when you just look at these figures, and I deliberately wanted to make these not very like bougie, new, cool box plot dispersion things. I wanted them to look like a bar chart you'd see in a business room because this has to be communicated well to the normal public, right? My audience in this case was unique. It was not just like I knew that people were going to digest this outside of our world of concussion research. And so I really wanted to intentionally make it incredibly approachable.
Mhm.
And so the thing that really surprised me, I think, was some of these studies go back pretty far because some of the consensus stuff goes pretty far.
Mhm.
Some of them were there were more studies that just did not even mention sex or gender in any way because it was so assumed that all athletes were male. There were more of those than mostly female studies. You know what I mean?
Wow.
Like, and
Yeah.
it's like Julianne and I had to dig in. And I also want to acknowledge Emily Jones, Lily Swope, who was one of my cadets, who did this study with me, and Melissa Anderson, who are the other co-authors besides Julianne and Steve.
Yeah.
Um, we had to like dig into these papers to make sure this sounds like a mostly male study or all male study, but we can't totally tell. Hockey studies from Canada in like 2001. And so some of but the just incredible imbalance of it really struck me. And then one other study really struck me was there was a study from Rochester, Minnesota, where the Mayo Clinic is.
Mm-hmm.
And they were able to look at long-term effects of football on brains um, because they just straight up went to the Rochester, Minnesota high school yearbooks of the past and just contacted people who still lived there. And
Wow.
like the fact that you could do that in male sports and there's just like not even close to an equivalent. There's not even a cohort that exists that's equivalent, let alone one you could just like, let's go to the high school and pull some rosters, you know?
Right.
So it was just really stark thinking about stuff like what kind of press is going to go on in this. I liked to pull out anecdotes that really just highlighted the starkness of that. And I think that that was one where I was like, wow, that is really a profound difference.
Yeah, I agree with you regarding the various charts that you used and being very intentional about the message that you're trying to say, especially to people who are not immersed in the research field. I'm also thinking about, your comment about the roster sizes. It's been interesting seeing football in particular how it has really changed since I participated in sports, and now there's this big emphasis on flag football, and now we have girls who are participating in football, and now we might be able to collect some of that data to see what are some changes if they go into tackle football over time, or what are the health benefits for eliminating the collision aspect and just participating in flag football. So it'll be interesting to see what those trends look like in the next, I don't know, 10 to 20 years.
Yeah, football was one of the big things that so the grants that Julianne and I wrote
Mhm.
that summer, she wrote one that got funded on self-report machine learning and how like doing a better analysis of what happens when people report late. The one that I wanted to do was following women across a whole sports year
Mhm.
and we had lined up the Air Force Academy rugby team and women's club rugby at UGA and soccer at both places.
Cool.
But we just couldn't make the math work because the funding amount was like $200,000. And we wanted to get an ATC to be at every practice.
Mhm.
And Julianne and I talking to each other, we're like, if we just slapped this ATC, the same exact study, right on a football team, they wouldn't have to divide their time. They'd have a big roster. They'd have all the support. And it's like, those are the kinds of micro choices that get made all the time.
Yeah.
And being in a behavioral sciences department with a bunch of sociologists, those are structural advantages for male sports, right? They have more prestige, they have more resources. They're more likely to hire this fifth extra ATC than like the new women's soccer league. Those people are really working hard just to cover everybody. And so
Mhm.
those built-in structural disadvantages cause a lot of this disparity. Because I know Julianne and I had very sincere efforts to get this study off the ground, and we didn't get it funded, but it just highlighted for us how everything just nudges you towards these big roster male sports, and you
Right.
have to be really intentional about what you're funding if you want to get the diversity we need in order to make sure that women have the proper health coverage for their concussions too.
Yeah, I actually want to highlight one of the points you make in your discussion that actually really emphasizes that. You mentioned that there's disproportionate male participation in and support for athletics, which ensures that many sponsor organizations supporting concussion research are male dominated or all male. So, for example, you highlight International Federation of Association Football, International Ice Hockey Federation, and the NFL. Although the NCAA DoD Care Consortium has made notable gender balanced efforts, we still know that broadly there is still that underrepresentation in female inclusion in these research studies.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And so another collaborator of mine, most of my collaborators now are women. And so Christine Baugh
Mm.
introduced me to the term. She's obviously, if you know this work, you probably know her as well. She's great. And pluralistic ignorance is this idea, right? But I think there's always a problem when you want to be efficient with research money, which is a good thing.
Mhm.
Um, if your only concern is efficiency with research money, you're always going to go to these big roster male sports. And so I think one of the big things you want to think about is how do we invest this not every single time do we go to the biggest possible sample size. We have to think about who are we collecting from and how covered have they been? Because we'll learn a lot more with a fewer participant study on female concussions than we will on yet another study. I don't want to like talk like we shouldn't be studying football. It's good to have research on football, and those big numbers can allow us to find out certain things quickly that can benefit everybody. But we need to be intentional is a really used word, but I think for a good reason. Here we want to think about what is the overall composition of research like,
Mm,
right? And so sometimes if we're making each of these decisions incrementally in a vacuum, you can wind up with this very monoculture look to your research portfolio, right?
mm-hmm. Yep, absolutely. I'm going to shift gears and talking about how some of this work could be applied clinically or just thinking about it clinically for those of us who are healthcare providers that are listening in. What do you believe, based on the research you've conducted, are some of the unique challenges female patients may experience more than male patients during their concussion recoveries?
Yeah, so I'm going to highlight something. So there's a few things I'd say. One is, as a non-clinician, I just want to express a little bit of humility in this space because those are hard calls to make.
Totally.
Um, one of my collaborators now is Erica King. She's a social worker in our department here, and so she does counseling, and they have to make a lot of hard calls. So she does research now on moral injury,
Wow.
and I really think that while we think of moral injury for people who are like military folks doing things and for good reason,
Mhm.
I think that healthcare has a really big component of this, which is what she's studying. And so I think that first off, I just want to remind you, you're doing a very hard job. And so it is important to like be kind to yourself as well, because these are really hard calls to make.
Yeah.
I believe was it Emily McIndoe talking about the overlap of certain concussion symptoms with different menstrual symptoms.
Yes.
I mean, the same is true um, of like out here when we have our cadets working super hard. Is it concussion or are they just like dehydrated and at
Right.
altitude for the first time? Those are hard calls to make. So I think that's one thing I would say. The other, I will steal a line from one of my cadets named Sydney, who is like, when you're in these very male spaces, there are times when I feel like I need to be more male and times when I need to feel like I'm being pressured to be a little more female. And the fact that sometimes you're even thinking about these acculturated choices at all
Hmm.
instead of just your own health is just another thing that, depending on the environment, women who are athletes may be forced to deal with more than men. And so I think just knowing your acculturation space and trying to build those good social norms up front is a really good thing.
Yeah, I imagine it's not totally the same, but I can see similarities between male athletes not wanting to disclose the injury because they want to be seen as tough and they can play through it. And similarly, if we have female cadets that are trying to embody more of that, male, feeling like tough and I can get through this, that could also potentially impede not only concussion reporting, but then also that recovery trajectory too, especially if they delay reporting.
100%, absolutely. And so that's actually one of the things that I've tackled the most. I kind of thought when I started this work, I would be doing EEG studies of memory with concussion and not without concussion and stuff. But so much of like, there's so little in our control, but when you report and how well you report is one of the only things that's in our control.
Right.
But it's really important to, so that's actually where I focused a lot of my energy. And I think you're right. That sort of acculturation here, one of the interesting things is athletes are a little bit better at reporting after they get here for a while. There used to be this issue with pilots who thought if you got a concussion, you could never fly. And they would be the people who are here getting acculturated out of reporting. So we published a paper on that. And good or bad, women who wanted to be pilots were just as likely to not disclose a concussion as men. So you can also see that it's about incentives too. It's
Right.
about incentives and identity and not just, what your personhood is that is driving these decisions. And so I think a really important thing is to set up ahead of having a culture where people are looking at these as injuries that you will recover from, but you do need to take care of. Um, doing that up front is really an important thing, I think, for everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. Where do you see the female specific concussion research moving towards over the next 10, 15, 20 years?
Yeah, so for me, one of the things that I see is, being I'm a little bit unique in this space as as a cognitive neuroscientist. I see things a little bit differently. And so I do want to shout out one of my professors here. I took this class in neural networks from a guy named Randy O'Reilly. So you're using software to
Okay.
sort of mimic how the brain does its job. And he said, you may wonder why there are so many excitatory neurotransmitters, but GABA is our only inhibitory one. And I was like, maybe I'm not smart enough for this program, but I actually never thought of that. But it was really a profound thing to me. And he's
Yeah,
like, the reason is because you need enough energy to do anything. And so lack of energy is a passive inhibitor for the brain, right?
right.
So for me, when I think about women's concussions for the next 15 to 20 years, the thing that I think about are things like we now have women who are breastfeeding and then going back to playing professional soccer, which we never used to have.
Right.
And like those are two huge energetic demands on the body. What does that look like? We know that other kinds of energetic demands on the body can make you more susceptible to concussions or lower that threshold temporarily, fatigue and things like that.
Hmm.
And so what is this cohort? And then as I was preparing my intro to neuroscience class this year, I'm looking over our endocrine system, again. And as we change through our lives, our hormones fluctuate. We go through, female athletes go through perimenopause and then menopause. But if you've had a bunch of either concussions or near concussions in your 20s, does that change that autonomic system regulation as you
Right.
get? We've never had a cohort of this numbers in that kind of a concussion susceptible sport that have gone through these changes.
Hmm.
And so I think prospectively, making sure that we are taking care and learning the lessons from those people who are like my age so that the 20-year-olds are going to have better information at their disposal.
Hmm.
I think about, if you're an ATC serving a professional women's soccer player who's a 28-year-old who's like so energetically expended from her job and then also breastfeeding and then has a concussion, what data are you drawing from to help treat that? That's just
Yeah.
really, I just don't think, for obvious reasons, the NCAA cohort just doesn't have that kind of data right now.
Yeah.
And so I'm thinking prospectively, we have this new cohort of full-time professional athlete women's in concussion susceptible sports. How are we observing them and involving them in the research in a way that gives them agency to where this goes and helps them have the kind of information they wish they had when they were 25?
Absolutely. I'm so glad that you brought up that perimenopausal group because as you were talking, I was thinking about as female athletes in particular are transitioning through their adulthood, we have individuals that go through perimenopause as early as their mid to even early 30s. And you're totally right that sustaining a concussion is such a huge energy expenditure. I didn't even really think about the added component of breastfeeding or even just being postpartum and restoring all of that energy that you expended going into labor. So I love those talking points. I thought that was a really great discussion.
Yeah, cool. Thank you. I really think that, yeah, perimenopause is like the kind of thing that my mom would never have talked about, but like all the
Never.
women who I talk to my age do.
Yeah.
And it's like connecting those two things, and just, there's the more you see this underrepresentation of women just in concussion, and it gets cited outside of our field now because it's
Yeah.
really pervasive, honestly.
Yeah.
But the under endometriosis is the other one that the number of people it affects and the lack of research that we see in that. You kind of once you sort of see this thing, you kind of can't unsee it everywhere. So yeah,
Mhm.
I'm glad you appreciate that, and I really agree that this whole lifetime focus is really important for people's health,
Absolutely. Well, Dr. Jallara, it was a pleasure speaking with you today and learning more about your research supporting female participation in sport and also just your perspective on where this field will go. Thank you for all of you for listening in to the Concussions and Women podcast. Please make sure to like and subscribe to the Concussion Talk podcast to stay up to date on the latest discussions on concussions.